Hello everyone, my name is Emily Sweeney, and today I'll be discussing the evolution of the Antiquities Act. Do preserves work? Alright, so a brief overview of what we'll be talking about today. First, we'll be looking at Theobald's Human Modification Map of the United States. We'll be focusing in on the origins and history of the Antiquities Act. We'll be talking about how U.S. presidents define and change the Antiquities Act, and we'll also be defining the different levels of protection that are currently in place. I will then explain the GIS model I created, which pairs human modification with the varying levels of protection. Finally, we'll discuss federal land protection and controversy today with a follow-up of economic data on the Grand Staircase Escalante monument. The first topic I'd like to discuss is human modification. In an article by David M. Theobald, he was able to quantify ecological integrity for landscapes by using human modification as one determinant. He sought out two factors within human modification, the first being a footprint, or F, which is the areal extent of a given human activity. The second factor was I, or intensity, the degree to which an activity at a location modifies an ecological footprint. The map here shows in dark green areas of low human modification, and the brownish color, high human modification, which is primarily focused in city centers. This idea of human modification impacting ecological integrity is one that will be carried with us through this presentation. Now we'll touch on a bit about the history of the Antiquities Act and its use. What did the sponsors of this act envision? Well, they agreed that national monuments would be small in area and geographically confined to the American Southwest. One big push that sold this act to its audience was that it could be used to preserve historical and archaeological sites, including a lot of Indian remains. However, there was opposition against this act, including Representative John Hall Stevens of Texas. He expressed his fear that the president might use the proposed act as Roosevelt had used the Forest Reserve Act. This made people wary about how much power would be given to the president, and if anything could check him from establishing these preserves. However, there were also a lot of supporters for the act, including General Land Office Commissioner William Richards. He had attempted on multiple occasions to give protection to petrified wood sites and Frijoles Canyon in New Mexico. However, his actions to preserve those parcels of land failed. He felt that this act was a way for the president to recognize unique and valuable landscapes and protect them without having to go through Congress. So now we will be discussing the legacy of the Antiquities Act. Perhaps the most remarkable feature of the Act itself is its brevity. The heart of the law consists of only 2 sentences. The President of the United States is authorized in his discretion to declare by public proclamation historic landmarks, historic and prehistoric structures, and other objects of historic or scientific interest that are situated upon the lands owned or controlled by the government of the United States. As you can see, that doesn't really create any type of design in terms of the size of these preserves, and it also gives the president a lot of power to define what he considers to be historic or significant to preserve. The Clinton administration embarked on what was most arguably the most ambitious expansion of the national monument system ever. He exceeded the impact of Theodore Roosevelt's administration. By the end of his second term, Clinton had proclaimed 22 new or expanded national monuments, adding approximately 6 million acres to the national monument sites. On September 8, 1996, Clinton stood at the south rim of the Grand Canyon and announced the creation of the 1.7 million acre Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument, which we will discuss later. This proclamation received a lot of cheers from the environmental community, but it caused uproar among political establishments of Utah and other parts of the West, which were reminiscent of other political battles over national monument proclamations. Even when viewed as an isolated use of the Antiquities Act, history will likely regard the Grand Staircase Escalante decision as one of the Clinton administration's most significant land protection initiatives. The Clinton National Monuments changed the way that we think about the Antiquities Act and protection. Initially, the Antiquities Act was all about protecting curiosities. Clinton protected entire ecosystems. National monument designations have traditionally been used to protect these curiosities or specific objects of unusual historic or scientific value that stand out in contrast to their landscape because of extraordinary beauty. However, almost all of the monuments created by Clinton revolve around large, historically significant ecosystems. Moreover, with the Clinton administration, management authority for national monuments was also broadened. Before this, all land removed by the act was taken from the Bureau of Land Management and given to the NPS. However, Grand Staircase Escalante was the first monument given to the BLM to manage, which means that they had to adopt new practices and an environmental focus. Today, a lot of the new monuments are afforded less protection than previously designated national monument lands. Hunting, grazing, even mining, oil and gas drilling, all these extractive purposes, are now allowed in some areas. So to bring it around to present day, let's talk about defining the levels of protection that exist. We call these levels gap statuses. Status 1 is an area having permanent protection from conversion of natural land cover and a mandated management plan in operation to maintain a natural site in which disturbance of events could occur. Status 2 is an area having permanent protection from conversion of natural land cover and a mandated management plan in operation, but which may receive uses or management practices that degrade the quality of existing natural communities, including suppression of natural disturbance. Status 3 is areas having permanent protection from conversion of natural land cover for the majority of the area. However, these areas are subject to extractive uses of either broad, low-intensity types, like logging, or localized intense types, like mining. And finally, gap status number 4 has no known public, private, institutional mandates or legally recognized protection easements. As you will see, there's a color-coordinated list to this. Status 1 as being the most protected, and Status 4 as potentially having the most human modification occur on its land. Which brings me to my research question. How does the level of protection and size of protected areas affect ecological integrity? The GIS model I used includes a protected areas database or PAD selection with a human modification layer. As you can see on the map, the dark green represents the lowest areas of human modification, while the red and orange represent the highest areas of human modification. The first human modification map I made shows federal lands with high levels of protection and areas greater than 50 square miles. The results presented on this graph show that the average human modification on highly protected federal lands in the U.S. averages at a low 5.5 in areas greater than 50 kilometers. Next, I made a map to compare with the original, also exhibiting high levels of protection, measuring human modification, with an area this time greater than 300 square miles. I wanted to compare the average human modification levels of both 50 kilometers and 300 kilometers. For the sake of making this graph easy to read, both the 50 kilometer and 300 kilometer measurements had been divided by 10. As you can see, the average human modification level goes from 5.5 to 4.6, a slight drop. Finally, I wanted to create a human modification map, also focusing in on areas with a high level of protection, but this time the areas focused in on would be greater than 500 square miles. This final graph shows the human modification levels for areas greater than 50 kilometers, areas greater than 300 kilometers, and areas greater than 500 kilometers in highly protected federal land areas. As you can see, the numbers do not vary much. Next, I was curious to examine human modification with lower levels of protection. This map exhibits that with an area greater than 50 square miles. On federal lands that are less protected in the United States, greater than 50 kilometers, the average human modification was 18.39. This map also exhibits places with lower levels of protection. However, we've expanded the area to greater than 300 square miles. This graph compares the average human modification between areas of 50 kilometers and areas of 300 kilometers. To keep this graph easy to read, I divided the areas in kilometers by 10. This shows a drop from 18.39 as the average human modification level to 4.41. Finally, the last human modification map I created also showcased lower levels of protection, but had an area greater than 500 square miles. Adding in the information from 500 square miles, we can see that human modification on federal lands with low protection dropped from 18.39 to 4.41 and finally to 3.39. So let's talk about our preliminary conclusions using GIS. Protecting wild places works. Where you have larger areas of protected lands, you also have higher environmental integrity. Gap status greatly impacts how land is subjected to human modification. Smaller areas of land often exhibit more human modification, and much of the preserved land in the U.S. is located in the west and southwest regions. However, today a lot of controversy is brewing. President Trump is not considered an environmentalist president. In fact, he's created plans to remove and redact portions of the Antiquities Act. Moreover, Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument has directly been affected by Trump's orders. On the following slides, we'll discuss some economic data about the designation. The New York Times recently posted in April an article about what is the Antiquities Act and why does President Trump want to change it. One of the points would be if existing monuments are reduced in size, it could benefit extractive industries that could help the U.S. economy. Moreover, the government could grant more leases on federal land. Trump lifted a moratorium on drilling on federal lands and the obligation to limit methane emissions on public lands. Officials may add fuel leases on public lands in the near future. And finally, there's an ideological impact. Western ranchers and sportsmen may not always have been a fan of the Antiquities Act because it limited some of their extractive purposes and a lot of their livelihoods. And Trump did make some changes. On April 25, 2018, he ordered his Interior Department to review the size and scope of national monuments larger than 100,000 acres created since 1996. He also wanted recommendations on how to scale some of those monuments backed by presidential authority or Congress. He described the designations as a massive federal land grab. However, there are some that could be hurt by these changes. Most Americans support the protection of public lands. According to a 2016 study from Harvard Kennedy School of Government, more than 93% of respondents said that historical sites, public lands, and national parks should be protected for current and future generations. This includes the scope of some of the maps I just discussed. So now we have those opposed, those in favor, and let's see who benefits. Well, in the early 20th century, when the West wasn't as populous, the federal authority that created these different designations for monuments and parks actually helped the local economies and drew visitors to isolated areas, which is why many of these national parks and monuments are located in the South and Southwest region. Moreover, before Trump, President Obama was considered an environmentalist president. He used the Antiquities Act more than any other president to set aside more than 3.9 million acres of land for federal protection. It's important to note, though, with today's present-day controversy, that Trump is not the first to reduce. According to National Park Service records, President Eisenhower reduced the reservation for Great Sand Dunes National Monument by 25%, and the largest percentage reduction was by President Taft in 1912 to his own reservation, the Navajo National Monument. He eliminated 320 of the original 360-acre reservation, which was an 89% reduction. Beyond the social, historical, and political realm, we also have to acknowledge the economic effects of these national monuments and parks. For instance, let's take Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument in Utah. This summary below is of the economic performance in the surrounding communities. The population from 2001 to 2015 grew by 13%, jobs by 24%, and per capita income grew by 17%. As touched on the previous slide, real per capita income grew 17% from 2001 to 2015 in the Grand Staircase Escalante region. The economy has grown since the designation of the national monument. This indicates growing prosperity in the region. Thank you for your time today, and I hope you can take away from my presentation some more information about human modification and how it affects ecological integrity, as well as the constant evolution of the Antiquities Act and how it is shaped by the social, political, and economic spheres we live in today. I'd also like to take a second to recognize the sources that made this presentation possible. Thank you and have a great day.